You know, a lot of people have said to me since 9/11, Islam, wow, that's a really angry religion. And my answer is, I don't think so. I do think, though, that there are a lot of Muslims who are angry. Because as a faith community, they live in some of the most repressive, autocratic, women-unfriendly countries on the face of the earth. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of them are angry. And I think religion, in some ways, is a mirror on your daily life and how you feel. Now, the question is, why do they have these repressive regimes? Well, I would argue it's a confluence of two factors, our interests and oil. The Arab world is cursed by oil.
Around the early 1970s, oil becomes the liquid gold. All of a sudden, you don't need to modernize your society. All you have to do is drill a hole in the ground, get the oil out, and sell it. This makes for economic stagnation, but it also makes for political stagnation, because there's always money for the secret police, there's always money for the army, and there's money to bribe people into a certain kind of dependence.
We are familiar with the doctrine, no taxation without representation. What Muslims are learning painfully is that the converse is also true. Governments in receipt of oil revenues don't need to tax their subjects. They don't need to have representative assemblies to help them impose and collect the taxes.
Backed by their oil profits, Middle Eastern dictators have brutally suppressed all opposition, allying themselves with extremist clerics to consolidate their power and contain dissent.
Since the 1970s, Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing states have spent millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on trying to use Islam as a legitimizing tool. And this has done a great deal of damage to Arab society, because Saudi Arabia does not really want to invest in secular forces, in liberal forces. It has a particular vision, a particular agenda, a particular program. And Islamists basically fit that particular agenda, that particular vision.
I think it's an unholy alliance between oil and conservative ideologies. Those preachers, they can go into the mosque, preach whatever they want, tell whatever, you know, extremist statements to their people they would like.
In Saudi Arabia, oil money has empowered an extremely intolerant version of Islam, Wahhabism, the chosen faith of the Saudi royal family. The Wahhabis believe that all reformers and modernizers are legitimate targets of violent jihad.
An inherent part of Wahhabism is to preach a jihadist philosophy. To even call it a philosophy is overly charitable, because it is a Spartan, very arid type of faith. You have your rules, they are cruel rules, you violate them, you're a dead woman, or you're a dead man.
Imagine that the Ku Klux Klan or some such organization manages to get control of all the oil of Texas and uses the proceeds of Texas oil to establish a network of well-endowed schools and colleges all over Christendom and beyond, peddling their very peculiar brand of Christianity. That would give you some equivalent, a rather pale equivalent, of what has happened in the Islamic world.
Over the last 3 decades, Wahhabi influence has extended well beyond the boundaries of Saudi Arabia through religious schools, charities, camps, and social organizations.
If you wanted money for an Islamic center in Indonesia, you got the money from the Saudi government or a Saudi charity, but it meant you had to either employ a Wahhabi preacher or accept the Wahhabi idea. And this has created a kind of globalization of Wahhabi Islam.
One result of the Wahhabi point of view is that it has resulted in a sense that, no, there's only one correct view. The other views are all heretical.
40 years ago, the Islam you would have seen around the world was an Islam that was very tolerant, capable of mixing with local cultures, tolerant of modernity, tolerant of the role of women in modern societies. And then you began to see the rise of this Wahhabi influence. People saying, no, you need something that's pure.
Osama bin Laden was raised within the Wahhabi doctrine. Some members of the Saudi royal family and Saudi charities allegedly fund Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and other terrorist organizations. And their clerics have reinterpreted the holy law of Islam, leading many Muslims to believe that terrorism is mandated by the Quran.
The holy law of Islam is clearly and strongly and overwhelmingly against suicide. It is a mortal sin for which there is no forgiveness. Even if a man has lived a life of unremitting virtue, if he kills himself, he forfeits paradise and goes straight to hell. Now, the Wahhabis lay down that you may commit suicide provided you take a sufficient number of the infidels with you.
There are legitimate grievances. One can debate the importance of them, but there are legitimate grievances about the way in which the colonial powers handled the Middle East, the way in which the United States has handled the Middle East, the treatment of Israel and the Palestinians. But that is not a cause that drives people to take their own lives in acts of violent political extremism. Otherwise, you'd find places around the world where people disagree with American foreign policy. The Chinese, South Koreans, people in Africa, suddenly using terrorism as a means of expressing protests about foreign policy. It doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because the use of terrorism, and particularly the use of suicide bombing, grows out of a much larger culture of political extremism and violence. And that's what we really have to understand.
By the early 1970s, fundamentalist Islam was no longer just an undercurrent in Middle Eastern politics. It was seen by many as the only viable alternative to the region's tyrannical rulers. And in 1979, it took center stage in Iran when popular anger against the Shah, an authoritarian monarch backed by the United States, was seized upon by a radical Shiite cleric, a man who would transform the Muslim world.
In 1979, I had never heard of Khomeini. But when his name began to appear in the newspapers, I did what professors normally do. I went to the university library to see if there was anything by him or about him. And there was a book by him called Islamic Government. This is the book which has since been described as Khomeini's Mein Kampf. And it's not a bad description.
In his book, Khomeini sets forth his intention to establish a government based on what he described as traditional Islamic practices. These practices, in fact, distorted traditional Islam so much that many considered them heretical. But very few believed Khomeini would actually succeed.
People who were demonstrating in the streets of Tehran, a lot of them were like me. They were not calling for a theocracy. They were calling for a change. They were tired of an autocratic ruler. They were tired of corruption that comes with dictatorship. I never heard anyone say, oh, you know, the good old times when they used to cut hands. Never, ever. Or the good old time when they used to stone people. I never heard that.
He created the illusion that there could be a new sense of identity and pride. The illusion that we're returning back to our own roots and traditions. Of course, it was a false sense of identity, because that sort of identity never existed. He was a very intelligent man, and he realized as soon as he came to power that you can't turn the clock back. You cannot go to the days of the Prophet, but you could use that mythology in order to, you know, gain roots.
Now, Khomeini was only one element within the revolution that overthrew the Shah. People often forget that power initially went to westernizing liberals. But what Khomeini understood was that in these kinds of power struggles, the extremes always win.
The taking of hostages at the American embassy in Tehran was the pivotal event. It gave Khomeini and his small band of followers an international prominence, a kind of legitimacy that allowed them to take control of a broad revolutionary movement. But to ordinary Iranian citizens, the revolution was not always what it seemed.
When we would go to the street where the American embassy was there, they would bring busloads of people from Tehran and from the suburbs and also from provinces. Some of these people didn't even know where they were going, and they would teach them slogans and they would pay for their day there. There would be a sort of a picnic atmosphere where people were eating sandwiches and Pepsi Cola and, you know, shouting death to America. And 2 streets away, people were just going about their business. Nobody was paying any attention. But it came out as if all the Iranian people were, you know, coming against America.
Khomeini had ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and a vision that in many ways mirrored theirs.
The Khomeini movement is Persian, not Arab, and Shiite, not Sunni. But again, it represents the same basic forces within the Islamic world and the same basic interpretation of the situation. Namely, we have imported foreign, pagan, infidel ways. We have abandoned our heritage. The remedy is to get rid of the infidel and restore a true Islamic state. For Khomeini, one of the major crimes of the Shah was the emancipation of women. In the Islamic Republic, the age of marriage was reduced from 18, where the Shah had put it, to 9.
When the revolution happened in Iran, we had women in all walks of life. We had 2 women ministers. We had women pilots, women industrialists. They changed all the laws regarding women. They made the veil mandatory. The way I look, the way I'm sitting here, I could be flogged and jailed and not allowed in the streets.
The subjugation of women is a very symbolic must in the Khomeini's Islamism, because it does terrorize the population. It does show that we're not going to let our population modernize, because, you know, this is a step in the modernization process.
All opposition to Khomeini was crushed.
The security apparatus is used to the fullest extent to control what people do, how they dress, where they go, what they read, what they hear, and as far as possible, what they think, certainly what they say. And it was supported by the most brutally repressive methods.
In the first 9 or 10 months of the Islamic Republic, more people were summarily executed, summarily, you know, in half-a-day trials, without attorneys, without appeal, than in the 15 or 20 years of the Shah's period.
Sometimes you would be going to work and they would be hanging people or stoning people whom they called prostitutes or adulterers. They would call people to come and, you know, watch or participate.
Khomeini's revolution had repercussions throughout the entire Muslim world. It marked a major change in ideology, a major transfer of power.
For the first time in Muslim history, as far as I'm aware, the professional men of religion control the state. This has never happened before. The clerical hierarchies had their importance, but they never developed to the degree that they did in Christendom. Now, for the first time in Islam, they have the functional equivalent of a pope, a college of cardinals, a bench of bishops, and above all, an inquisition.
Khomeini, in a way, invents modern Islamic fundamentalism, by which I mean there have been strands of Islamic fundamentalism around for 100 years. But what Khomeini does is he gives it political teeth.
The Iranian Revolution encouraged extremist Islam around the world, but especially in the Middle East. In Saudi Arabia, extremists violently seized the Great Mosque in Mecca. And in Egypt, radicals tried to usher in an Islamic theocracy by assassinating President Anwar Sadat, the hand-picked successor of the great modernizer Jamal Abdul Nasser. Sadat had not only pursued peace with Israel, he had labeled Khomeini a lunatic, offered safe haven to the Shah, and curtailed the holy law of Islam.
Sadat's offense was changing things at home by bringing in Western ways and Western laws. He was murdered on a public ceremony. A lot of people said he was murdered because he made peace with Israel. The evidence is that is simply untrue. On the actual moment when he was murdered, the leader of the group who murdered him stood up and shouted proudly, "I have killed Pharaoh." If Sadat's offense was being soft on Israel, that would seem an odd choice of phrase to use.
In the Quran, the Exodus story is told much as it is in the Bible. The Hebrews are the heroes, and Pharaoh is the villain. He is an oppressor of God's people, an idolater, a corrupter. In modern terms, a westernizer.
I've killed Pharaoh. Pharaoh in the Islamic tradition is the tyrannical, unbelieving ruler. And the pagan idolaters are legitimate targets of jihad.
The assassination of Sadat revealed that these regimes that had been coasting on military power, police brutality, oil money, were fundamentally unstable because they had produced within them very large, violent opposition movements, and they had never figured out what to do with them. They had never figured out a way to open up the system, to give people voice so that you would drain support away from the Islamic fundamentalists. And Sadat's assassination was the most violent reminder of the essential fragility of this bargain that Arab regimes have made. They can maintain themselves in power only as long as they turn the screws down on every oppositional movement, which only makes the opposition more and more violent.
Sadat's killers were followers of Sayyid Qutb, a radical Egyptian whose disciples had splintered off from the Muslim Brotherhood.
We are Muslims who believed in their religion.
They included Aman al-Zawahiri, who would later become one of Osama bin Laden's most trusted advisors. And many consider Qutb, who was executed by Nasser in 1966, to be bin Laden's spiritual forefather.
If you look at what Al-Qaeda is, we're seeing the convergence of two different streams. The Egyptian radicals, after they kill Sadat, there are several crackdowns on them, and a lot of them start going off to Afghanistan. And then after the war begins against the Russians, they're actually recruited out of Saudi Arabia when we get Al-Qaeda as a global movement.
In Afghanistan, bin Laden began to develop Al-Qaeda's goals and tactics, seeking to foment Islamic revolution, much as Khomeini did in Iran. He used the Soviet invasion to gain support and credibility. Aided by the Saudi government and the CIA, he called for jihad against the Russians and led forces against them with great success.
As Osama bin Laden and his followers see it, the defeat and collapse of the Soviet Union was not a Western achievement, but a Muslim achievement. It was a result of the guerrilla warfare in Afghanistan. I think the story of the collapse of the Soviet Union is a little more complicated than that. But this explanation does not lack plausibility.
In 1990, with the Soviet Union in tatters, bin Laden developed a new rallying cry when Saddam Hussein, a man who had been supported by America for decades, invaded Kuwait, a sovereign Muslim nation.
He put forward a proposal to the Saudi ruling class at the time. Let me bring my Afghan Arab warriors. Let me use these forces. Let me reorganize them and help in the ejection of Saddam from Kuwait. Of course, he was treated with disdain and discarded. Whereupon he turned from the man who was willing to deal with the Saudi ruling class into an inveterate enemy of that state.
In 1991, Bin Laden was expelled from Saudi Arabia for trying to replace the royal family with an Islamic regime. He reemerged in Sudan, working with Egyptian radicals, seeking to overthrow the governments of the Middle East. But he soon found a more effective strategy.
Bin Laden's genius was to say to these people, don't blame the Egyptians or the Saudis, let's go for the head of the snake, the United States, which supports all these regimes. Now, it may be fair or unfair, but politically it's a masterstroke because he recognized that it's much easier to do terrorism against the United States than it is to do it against Egypt. You see, doing terrorism in a police state is very, very difficult. They kill you.
You have to ask, what is it that the terrorists want? Not the young people, not the cannon fodder who are asked to go and commit suicide, but what do these leaders want? What do these heads of the terrorist movements want? I view Osama bin Laden as someone whom, if the Saudi system allowed him to run for power, he would have tried to run for political office.
Imagine you're a Saudi Arabian man or woman, and you have to look for a role model in your society. You can either look at one of the 6,000 members of the royal family, corrupt, lazy, ignorant, people who have held their country back. Then there's this one guy who gives up a great fortune to go to the mountains of Afghanistan and risk his life. It's not difficult to see why that would have a certain kind of appeal.
But bin Laden's appeal is not only based on his battlefield success. It is also a religious appeal.
Those who support
It is also a religious appeal.
Those who support Al-Qaeda are those who believe that there is a cosmic ongoing struggle between the true faith and the unbelievers. We say, quite rightly, that we are not engaged in a war against Islam. They say that they are engaged in a war for Islam, and that the time is approaching for the final victory of the true faith.
Al-Qaeda does not represent mainstream Islam, but it does constitute a significant stream within Islamic fundamentalism. And its leaders have attracted supporters by continually referring to the many grievances that have animated Islamic politics in the last century. Palestine has been given a unique role in this discourse. For many Muslims, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians transcends all else, feeding deep animosities, unifying people who otherwise have little in common.
I don't think the West appreciates the depth of the grievances that the Palestinian conflict really plays in Arab imagination. It's seen as part and parcel of the continuing onslaught of the West against Arabs and Muslims.
Those are huge emotional issues in the Arab Muslim world, fueling a lot of the rage and anger at the United States and the West. But that's not the only story.
That conflict provides the perfect safety valve. It is the licensed grievance. People are justifiably angry with their rulers, and this is the one thing where they can really let off steam. It serves a very useful purpose.
The Arab states have not had an interest in settling the refugees, giving them citizenship, and putting an end to the problem.
Lebanon has laws that prevent Palestinians from holding down full-time jobs, from owning property, from becoming professionals. Saudi Arabia, you know, has oodles of money, has bank vaults that are stashed with gold, has no shortage of space, has never taken Palestinians in as citizens.
The Arab governments benefit from it. It serves to deflect criticism. I mean, if there were no Israel, if the Palestine problem didn't exist, they would have to face the undivided, undeflected anger of their suffering subjects. No excuses.
are dealing with a legacy and a weight, a burden, a millstone around our necks, a heavy, heavy millstone of the past. It is the past that is speaking through these Muslim clerics. It is the past that is speaking through the positions of the Arab governments. And it is the past that is speaking through the Islamic terrorists from all over the world with no country base of origin.
What America has to ask itself is, can it do something to get at the root cause of 9/11? And by root cause, I don't mean poverty or something generic like that. I mean the frustration and political extremism that has developed in the Arab world. Can we help reform the Arab world? If we don't do that, you're likely to see the same cesspool of stagnation from which Osama bin Laden came. And if bin Laden is gotten rid of and Al-Qaeda is destroyed, some other similar organization will come up.
After September 11, America led an invasion of Afghanistan and then invaded Iraq in what has turned out to be a controversial effort to thwart terrorism and plant the seeds of democracy in the region.
This part of the world didn't get in this hole in one generation. It's not going to get out of it in one generation. Our objective in Iraq, should be decent government. Give me 2 generations in Iraq who grow up in just a decent atmosphere, and I'll start to give you civil society and a different Middle East.
I think the challenge facing Arabs and Muslims is how to separate the idea of constitutionalism and democracy from the idea of Western colonialism. How do you link democracy, liberalism, human rights from that terrible face in relation between the Arab-Muslim world and the West?
There is a conception and a misconception, I suggest, in the West that Islam equals anti-democracy, that Islam is only a fascist type of a regime. However, fascism can exist in any kind of a system. Islam itself is fundamentally anti-fascistic because its ideas are one of universal brotherhood, of caring for your fellow human being, and for worshiping God, and for human freedoms.
What do people want in the Middle East? What do people want anywhere in the world? They want to be treated with dignity, with respect. Respect. The word respect is very important for people who have been humiliated for so long.
We become mature through accepting responsibility and understanding that we're accountable. That doesn't mean exonerating others, but it means that the first thing that we need to do is to start being accountable and to start going over our own histories.
By now, there is no doubt at all among people in the Islamic world that things have gone badly wrong. They tried military methods and all they got was bigger and better defeats. They tried constitutional government and they got Nazi-style tyrannies. They tried socialism and they got a string of broken down economies and an economic level which is among the worst in the world. So how do you react to this? Well, basically there have been 2 reactions in the Muslim world. One reaction is that of the religious extremists and fundamentalists. It would run something like this. For hundreds of years now, we have been aping the ways of the West, and the remedy, therefore, is to return to the past. That was the doctrine of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, of Khomeini and of his successors and followers. That was the doctrine of the murderers of President Sadat in Egypt, the doctrine of Al-Qaeda and of Osama bin Laden. There are others who believe that what they suffered from is not excessive modernization, but insufficient and inept modernization. The way to go is to take the best elements from the West, marry them to the best elements from their own cultural traditions, and try to move forward that way. If they succeed, the Middle East will be able, once again, to be a major center of civilization, of achievement and progress. I believe that it is possible.